March 8, 2014 began as an ordinary Saturday morning at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Ground crews completed their final checks. Passengers moved through boarding gates in the usual unhurried rhythm of early morning departures. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 pushed back from the terminal on schedule. The Boeing 777-200ER, carrying 227 passengers and 12 crew members, lifted off the runway at 12:41 in the morning local time and turned northeast toward Beijing. Within 38 minutes, the aircraft made its last routine radio contact with air traffic control. After that exchange, the voices fell permanently silent. No distress call was transmitted. No warning signal was sent. A plane carrying 239 people simply ceased to exist within the established frameworks of modern aviation tracking. The world would spend the next decade trying to understand how something so enormous could vanish so completely. The passenger manifest reflected the scale of what was lost. Of the 227 passengers aboard, 153 held Chinese citizenship. Among them, a group of 19 artists and their families returning from a calligraphy exhibition held in Kuala Lumpur. 38 passengers were Malaysian nationals, with the remaining seats filled by citizens of 12 other countries. 20 passengers worked as employees of Freescale Semiconductor, a multinational technology company with offices across Asia. 2 of those aboard were infants. The aircraft's captain had accumulated more than 18,000 hours of flight time across a career spanning back to 1981 with Malaysia Airlines. Him, one of the most experienced pilots in the company's fleet. His first officer was considerably newer to the Boeing 777. Having only recently completed his transition to the aircraft type and operating what was effectively his final supervised training flight before full certification, the aircraft itself gave investigators no obvious cause for concern when they later reconstructed its maintenance history. The Boeing 777-2000ER, registered as 9MMRO, had accumulated 53,471 hours and 7,526 flight cycles across its operational life, an unremarkable figure for a wide-body aircraft of its age. Its most recent routine maintenance check had been performed on February 23, 2014, just 13 days before the flight. All applicable airworthiness directives for both the airframe and its 2 Rolls-Royce Trent 892 engines were confirmed compliant. A crew oxygen system replenishment had been carried out on March 7th, the day before departure, with nothing unusual observed during that procedure. The Boeing 777 holds one of the strongest safety records of any commercial aircraft type ever produced. Mechanical failure, in the opinion of every investigative body that subsequently examined the evidence, remained an extremely unlikely explanation for what happened. At 1:19 in the morning, the flight's co-pilot transmitted what would become the final recorded communication from MH370 to Malaysian Air Traffic Control. The phrasing was routine, a standard acknowledgement, as the aircraft crossed into Vietnamese airspace. Seconds later, the aircraft's transponder, the device that broadcasts a plane's identity and altitude to secondary radar systems on the ground, was deactivated. Whether that deactivation was performed manually or resulted from some other cause became one of the central and unresolved questions of the entire investigation. What the secondary radar showed at that point was simply nothing. The signal that should have been there was gone. Vietnamese air traffic controllers, expecting to receive MH370 on their frequencies, heard only silence. D saw only a blank screen where the aircraft's return should have appeared. What Malaysian military primary radar revealed in the hours that followed represented the first genuinely alarming detail of the entire sequence. Unlike secondary radar, which depends on a transponder signal broadcast from the aircraft, primary radar works by bouncing energy off the physical body of a plane and detecting the reflected return. The Malaysian military's primary radar system continued to track an aircraft that matched MH370's flight profile for approximately another hour after the transponder went dark. The track it recorded showed the plane executing a sharp turn to the left, reversing its northeastern heading and flying back across the Malay Peninsula in a westward direction. The aircraft then turned again, this time to the northwest, tracking up over the Strait of Malacca and continuing until it faded beyond radar range approximately 200 nautical miles west-northwest of Penang Island. The deliberate nature of that course change was difficult to explain through any mechanical or accidental hypothesis. Satellite communications data provided the only remaining thread connecting investigators to the aircraft after it left radar coverage, a system aboard the aircraft called ACARS. That automatically exchanges technical data with ground stations had been partially disabled at some point, but a separate satellite link maintained automated hourly handshake signals with a communications satellite operated by the British company Inmarsat. These handshakes, sometimes called pings, carried no navigational content of their own, but Inmarsat analysts discovered that the timing and frequency characteristics of each signal contained measurable information about the aircraft's distance and velocity relative to the satellite, using a technique that had never previously been applied in an air accident investigation. The team calculated a series of arcs representing all possible positions where the aircraft could have been at the moment of each hourly ping. The final ping came at 8:19 in the morning, approximately 7 hours after takeoff. A partial signal followed 6 minutes later, cut off before completion, consistent with the aircraft losing power. The arc derived from that final transmission crossed two broad corridors, one extending northward over Central Asia, and one extending southward deep into the remote southern Indian Ocean. Investigators assessed the northern corridor against military radar data from multiple nations bordering that route, and found no corroborating evidence that any aircraft had passed through that airspace. The southern corridor became the focus of the investigation. It pointed toward one of the most isolated and inhospitable stretches of ocean on the planet, a region of the southern Indian Ocean so remote that seafloor mapping in the relevant area was virtually non-existent before the search for MH370 began. The aircraft, if the satellite analysis was correct, would have crossed thousands of kilometers of obscurity and water before exhausting its fuel supply and descending into the sea, far beyond the reach of any rescue operation. Even if one had been possible, the international response to the disappearance mobilized on a scale that had no precedent in civil aviation history. In the immediate days after March 8th, search and rescue assets from more than 24 countries spread across the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, eventually the vast southern Indian Ocean. Ships, aircraft, and satellite systems were redirected from other missions to support the effort. The initial search zones covered hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, with no confirmed debris to anchor the operation to any specific location. Families of passengers gathered in Beijing and Kuala Lumpur, receiving almost no useful information during those first agonizing weeks, a failure of communication that generated intense and lasting anger among those who had lost relative lives. Aboard the flight, it was not until July 29, 2015, more than 16 months after the disappearance, that the first confirmed fragment of MH370 came ashore. A beach cleaner on the island of Réunion, a French territory in the western Indian Ocean, roughly 4-000 kilometers west of the primary underwater search zone, discovered a large curved section of aircraft structure in the debris along the shoreline. Investigators identified it within days as the right-wing flaperon of a Boeing 777. Serial numbers and maintenance records confirmed beyond doubt that the component had come from 9mmRO. The discovery placed debris on the correct side of the ocean basin to be consistent with the southern Indian Ocean impact hypothesis. Drift modeling calculations suggested the flaperon's journey from the crash site to Réunion was physically plausible. given the region's known ocean current patterns. Over the months that followed, additional pieces accumulated on coastlines stretching across the western Indian Ocean basin. Fragments arrived on the shores of Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar, and Mauritius. In total, investigators eventually examined 27 pieces of debris potentially linked to MH370, with 3 confirmed by physical analysis as originating from the aircraft, and 17 assessed as probably belonging to the flight. Among the later pieces recovered was a section identified as horizontal stabilizer structure, significant because its presence indicated the aircraft had not glided gently into the ocean in a controlled ditching. Forensic analysis of the fragment's fracture pattern suggested the airframe had impacted the water at high velocity and broken apart violently on contact. The primary underwater search operation, conducted jointly by Malaysia, Australia, China, ran from late 2014 through January 2017 and covered an area of seafloor more than 1,800 kilometers in length and between 86 and 146 kilometers wide, totaling close to 120,000 square kilometers of deep ocean terrain. Search vessels equipped with towed sonar systems and remotely operated vehicles worked methodically through the search zone that sat at depths between 1,000 and 6,000 meters beneath the surface. The underwater landscape in that region, sculpted by mid-ocean ridge geology and ancient volcanic activity, was extraordinarily complex. Acoustic shadows and false returns that complicated sonar interpretation. Despite an operation of unprecedented scope and technical sophistication, no wreckage was located. The search was formally suspended in January 2017 with no result. A second commercial search effort began in January 2018, when the company Ocean Infinity contracted with the Malaysian government under a no-find, no-fee arrangement, under which the company would receive $70 million only upon successfully locating confirmed wreckage from the aircraft. Ocean Infinity deployed multiple autonomous underwater vehicles simultaneously, rather than relying on a single towed sonar. The company covered terrain far more rapidly than the earlier government-led operation. The new search extended into areas north of the original search zone. Based on revised analysis of the satellite ping data and updated drift modeling from the recovered debris, that operation also ended without locating the main wreckage field, though it added tens of thousands of additional square kilometers to the total area of seafloor examined and eliminated further candidate zones from consideration. The Malaysian government released its formal safety investigation report on July 31, 2018, more than 4 years after the disappearance. The document acknowledged the fundamental limitation that shaped every conclusion within it. Without the aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, no definitive determination of cause was possible. The investigation nonetheless concluded that the change in flight path after the transponder deactivation most likely resulted from manual inputs, meaning a human being at the controls deliberately altered the aircraft's course. The report found that while foul play was probably involved, investigators could not establish who had redirected the aircraft or why. The identities and mental states of everyone aboard the flight, reviewed exhaustively, yielded no clear answer. Could a single individual have planned and executed the controlled disappearance of a fully crewed wide-body airliner carrying 239 people? Behind almost no recoverable evidence, suspicion focused most intensely on the captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, in part because of a discovery made during the FBI's forensic analysis of his home flight simulator. A deleted data file recovered from the simulator's hard drive contained a series of waypoints that, when plotted on a map, traced a route extending southward from the Malay Peninsula across the Indian Ocean toward an endpoint in one of the most remote ocean regions on Earth. The route bore a striking resemblance to the path that satellite analysis suggested MH370 had actually flown. Malaysian and Australian authorities confirmed the existence of this simulator data. though investigators publicly maintained that no evidence conclusively established Zahari as responsible for the diversion. His family and colleagues disputed any suggestion of criminal intent, describing him as a dedicated professional with no apparent motive for such an act. The hypoxia theory presented an alternative to deliberate human action. Investigators from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau noted at various points that a rapid depressurization event, if it incapacitated or killed everyone aboard shortly after the transponder was disabled, could theoretically explain a ghost flight continuing on autopilot for hours before fuel exhaustion. Under this scenario, whoever disabled the transponder and altered the course did so before losing consciousness, possibly in response to an emergency they could not fully control. The aircraft would then have flown its programmed heading unattended for the remainder of the flight. The theory never achieved consensus among investigators and left significant gaps in explaining the precise sequence of events, particularly the deliberate and apparently purposeful nature of the course alterations recorded by military radar in those early minutes. In December 2024, retired scientist Vincent Line published a formal analysis in the Journal of Navigation that challenged one of the investigation's foundational assumptions. Line argued that the final two satellite signals received from MH370 were more consistent with a controlled eastward descent than with the accepted model of an uncontrolled dive into the southern Indian Ocean following fuel exhaustion. If the aircraft was under human control during its final minutes, if it descended eastward rather than plunging vertically, the entire probability map for the wreckage location would need to be recalculated, and the seabed search area shifted substantially. The paper added a new layer of uncertainty to an investigation already defined by the absence of answers, illustrated how profound low, with a lack of physical wreckage, had constrained every analytical effort made over the preceding decade. In March 2024, the Malaysian government approved a new agreement with Ocean Infinity to resume active searching in the southern Indian Ocean, targeting an area of approximately 15,000 square kilometers identified through refined analysis of all available data. Poor weather conditions in the target region delayed the actual deployment of search vessels until late in the year, as the southern Indian Ocean in its winter months generates sea states that make deep-water survey operations impractical and dangerous. The Cabinet subsequently approved an extension of the no-find, no-fee contract with Ocean Infinity through June 30, 2027, with Transport Minister Anthony Loke stating that the decision represented the government's continuous and unwavering commitment to provide closure for the families of those aboard the flight. The organization Voice 370, that represents the families and loved ones of MH370's 239 occupants, has consistently urged authorities to maintain and expand the search while simultaneously pressing for greater transparency about the investigation's findings. Ocean Infinity's renewed search operation deployed the vessel Armada 7806, equipped with a fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles manufactured by the Norwegian firm Kongsberg. Each vehicle is capable of operating independently at depths of up to 6.66. Since first conducting operations in 2018, Ocean Infinities have up to 100 hours before returning to the surface for data download and battery replenishment. The vehicles carry side-scan sonar, synthetic aperture sonar, multi-beam sonar, and sub-bottom profiling sonar. Each unit, the ability to produce highly detailed imagery of seafloor terrain at resolution levels far beyond what the original towed sonar systems could achieve. Since first conducting operations in 2018, Ocean Infinity has spent 151 days at sea and mapped more than 140,000 square kilometers of ocean floor in connection with the MH370 search, an area of seafloor investigation with no parallel in the history of civil aviation accident investigation. The families who have lived with uncertainty since March 8, 2014 have occupied a position unlike that of any other group in the long history of aviation disasters. In most major accidents, wreckage is recovered quickly, Black boxes yield their recordings. Investigators can provide at minimum a factual account of how and why the aircraft came down. The families of MH370's occupants received none of that. For more than a decade, they have existed in a condition that offers neither the closure of confirmed death nor the genuine possibility of survival. A liminal state in which grief cannot find its natural resolution because the loss itself remains technically unconfirmed by any physical evidence directly linking the ocean to the specific fate of each person aboard. Chinese families in particular organized sustained public pressure campaigns, demanding transparency from both the Malaysian government and the airline, expressing repeated frustration at what they characterized as withheld information and deliberate obfuscation. The debris that did reach shore carried its own form of painful ambiguity, a fragment of interior cabin structure that washed onto a beach in Madagascar carried a printed stencil whose characters matched Boeing 777 production specifications. But the piece could not be definitively assigned to MH370 from physical evidence alone. Seat cushion foam recovered from the East African coastline bore characteristics consistent with commercial aircraft interiors. But foam without embedded serial components cannot be traced to a specific airframe. Only 3 of the 27 examined pieces were confirmed beyond reasonable doubt. The rest occupied a gray zone of probability, each one physically representing the aircraft and the people who had traveled on it, yet legally and scientifically unable to deliver the certainty that would anchor any final official conclusion about the flight's end. 12 years after the aircraft disappeared from radar screens northeast of Kuala Lumpur, the seabed of the southern Indian Ocean still holds whatever remains of MH370 in complete silence. The search area currently under examination by Ocean Infinity's autonomous vehicles lies at some of the greatest water depths accessible to practical commercial search technology. Under pressure conditions that would crush unprotected equipment instantly, and at distances from the nearest port that require weeks of sailing time, simply to reach the site. The underwater terrain in the search zone has been described by the geologists and hydrographers working the operation as among the most geologically complex seafloor yet mapped, with ancient ridge structures and abyssal plains intersected by fault scarps that create deep shadowed valleys, where sonar returns become unreliable. Each survey pass covers new ground that no human instrument had ever previously examined. Each pass that reveals only undisturbed seafloor narrows the remaining possibility space by a fraction of a percentage point. The question of whether MH370 will ever be found has no clean answer available to offer. The search area derived from satellite analysis represents a statistical probability corridor rather than a precise location. The uncertainty bands surrounding that corridor remain wide enough to encompass many thousands of square kilometers of unsearched ocean. If the aircraft lies within the current search zone, and the autonomous vehicles pass close enough to detect its debris field, the case will break open after more than a decade of silence. If it lies outside that zone, if the assumptions built into the satellite analysis carry systematic errors that shift the true impact location by even a modest distance in the wrong direction, then the primary wreckage of MH370 could remain undetected indefinitely. The investigation continues in the deep water, conducted by machines, operating in darkness at depths where no human can follow, searching square kilometer by square kilometer through one of the most remote environments on Earth.